challenge your imagination to come alive and to battle with the creatures of Dungeons and Dragons. Grapple against the forces of evil as a Marvel Comics superhero. Hunt adventure and glory as Indiana Jones. The all-new role-playing games of TSR and Dungeons and Dragons. Unleash the power of your imagination.
Now what do I do? Okay, this is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons video game cartridge.
You have to buy it separately to play on the Intellivision video game system.
Mom and Dad have to hook it up to the TV. What next? We're trying to find a crown, but it's real easy to get lost. So don't be surprised if the dragon finds you first. Holy cats, you just killed the dragon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons video game cartridge and Intellivision master component from Mattel Electronics, each sold separately.
In the eerie world of deep, dark dungeons, mystery and magic seem real. There's good against evil with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons action figures. War Duke, Kellic, Strongheart, and Bronze Dragon, each sold separately.
Beware, Strongheart. We will cast an evil spell and steal the treasure.
Fool! Evil is no match for good. The treasure is safe.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons action figures, Kellic, War Duke, Bronze Dragon, Strongheart, each sold separately from LJN.
Don't touch that! Navigate the maze. Escape the dungeons. Slay the dragons.
Don't you think that's just a little bit out of our league?
Dungeons and Dragons, rated PG-13, starts Friday. Dungeon Master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure!
TSR Hobbies, Dungeons and Dragons games. Products of your imagination.
Open your mind to Dungeons and Dragons computer game from Mattel Electronics. It will lead your imagination down a dungeon labyrinth wherein lies the dragon's treasure. Steal his treasure, but make no false moves. For in Dungeons and Dragons, a dead end is a dead end. Dungeons and Dragons from Mattel Electronics.
Ha! Ihr kriecht durch Kerker, um mich zu besiegen? Narren! Meine Monster werden euch vernichten! Uah! Die Helden greifen an mit Zaubersprüchen, Schwertern, Keulen und Zaubertrank! Entscheidet die Schlacht in 11 spannenden Missionen mit 40 Figuren und vielen Aktionskarten. Dungeons and Dragons. Deine Zeit ist gekommen.
Open the world of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons action figures. Strongheart, Bronze Dragon, War Duke, Nightmare. Discover a world of mystery and magic.
Stand back, Strongheart. You shall never have this treasure.
Evil is no match for good until we meet again.
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons action figures from LJN. Pure magic.
hora de voltar pra casa, crianças.
Tolos, nunca escaparão.
Beto, faz alguma coisa!
Deixe o impossível pra trás.
Peraí, cadê a Uni?
Novo Renault Kwid Outsider, o SUV dos compactos.
It really saved our marriage.
We couldn't find a single activity we'd like to do together.
He's so into his skeet shooting.
Pull!
And I love my yoga. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons always sounded like so much fun, but with that 20-sided die, I thought, oh brother.
And all those manuals.
But that's where the book comes in.
Have you ever wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons but were too intimidated to try? You are not alone. D&D is a hugely popular pastime that lets you ride your imagination into a mythical world full of beasts and sorcery. But many people think D&D is too complicated. Not to worry, friends. D&D for Dummies makes it fun and easy, giving you all you need to play, including ready-made characters and maps.
D&D for Dummies hooked it up. It gave me the confidence I needed to begin my journey from first-level barbarian to epic-level dungeon master.
And it gave us something fun and creative that we can do together.
That too.
Available at your favorite book and...
Good evening. Tonight we begin with a story about make-believe adventure and real-life violence, and what some critics fear is a connection between the two in a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Millions of children and teenagers now play Dungeons and Dragons. They are drawn to the adventure, fantasy, and suspense the game creates through mythical characters and complex situations.
But increasingly, parents and psychiatrists are warning that the game is taking some children too far into the realm of dark and violent fantasy. They wonder whether for some children, Dungeons and Dragons becomes more than just a game. Carol Jerome prepared this report.
Okay, you enter a very small room, and there's a large black coffin right in the center. The gates shut behind you, slamming.
It looks like a few boys around a table, but in their minds, they're fantastical characters in another world, a darker world. Ole is a cavalier. Erwin is a paladin. Dennis is a ranger. Mikey is an illusionist. And Bill is a magic user. Nicholas is a fighter, and his little brother Matthew is a thief. In today's adventure, Mike the Dungeon Master leads them to a castle where they are attacked by wolves in the woods.
What are you guys gonna do?
I'm gonna draw my sword and use my second attack instead of attacking.
What do you do?
Together, they meet each challenge set by the Dungeon Master according to their character, which can be good or evil. They have magic weapons and spells to use to battle men and half-humans and monsters. And each has an elaborate scoring sheet for his character, with points for wisdom and strength and the like. A throw of these special dice decide the outcome of battles in an intricate scoring system. Nothing is acted out. The real action is in the mind.
Now you guys are entering the castle. So you have basically the doors are open to the castle, sort of somebody taunting your mind saying, come and get me. Suddenly 5 zombies come up, grabbing your leg. What are you gonna do?
I like to hit him with my sword +3.
Okay, you roll the dice. Okay, you do sufficient damage and you cut off its arm, you dismember it. But you notice that the arm that you cut off is still hanging onto your leg.
It's not as simple as old-fashioned cowboys and Indians. The goal here is to survive each adventure and gain points for killing enemy humans and monsters, and gather treasure along the way. But this medieval fantasy world is so detailed, so real, that some say it has caused kids to kill in the real world.
Since these games are so violence-oriented, you do not just play at the game, you become the game. You are the game.
Hat-pulling son Bink shot himself in the heart 3 years ago, hours after a suicide curse was put on his character as he played D&D, as the game is called. Notes he left linked his suicide to the game. Pat Pulling formed a group called BAD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Along with the National Coalition of Television Violence in the States, BAD documents 28 cases of juvenile murder and suicide they claim are linked to D&D. They say it's the general violence and playing with evil characters, suicide curses, and pretend human sacrifice in the game that trigger the tragedies. Ironically, the publicity about one of these cases in 1979 made sales skyrocket.
It has been linked in suicide notes, police reports, and coroner's reports. There have been recently a couple of accidental killings, one in particular related to the game where the boy thought he was a god. Therefore, he begged his brother to shoot him to prove that he was deified. And in fact, of course, the boy died.
I feel they're overreacting a lot. Like, I don't think that this game promotes death or anything. Not the way we play it anyway.
You know, I can tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Just about everyone I play with can.
Sure, there's bloodshed and everything, but I think it's better to shed it in the game than out in real life. My adopted daughter, the fair Irina, has been these past nights bitten by a creature called...
The game's public relations man says the children in the murders and suicides, including Bink Pulling, had other emotional problems already, and notes other elements like the presence of guns in the home.
There has been 0 deaths as the cause of Dungeons and Dragons. The game is played by some 3 to 4 to almost 5 million people now in Canada, in the United States, throughout the world. In fact, 15 other countries. And the game is built around cooperation.
Come on, everybody!
The Dungeons and Dragons ride!
Started in 1973 on a $1,000 loan, D&D now earns $30 million a year for its Wisconsin manufacturer TSR, with spin-offs like this television cartoon series.
There is no escape from the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
Few girls play it, it's mainly teenage boys, and they can spend hundreds of dollars on it in stores like Rigby's in Toronto, on monthly magazines, pocketbooks, guidebooks to over 40 different fantasy adventures, and miniature figurines. And if they like, there are D&D video games too.
Congratulations, Foil. You have won more next time. Or maybe it's just an imagination.
At least 3 government studies in the States confirm a cause and effect relationship between consumption of violent entertainment and increased aggression. Police are also concerned about D&D, but they say they cannot make a conclusive judgment about its role in many of the murders and suicides. One of the most perplexing cases happened here in St. Louis, Missouri. Last April, an 18-year-old art student named Mary Towie was killed by 2 friends, Ron Adcox and Darren Molitor. All 3 played Dungeons and Dragons together, Darren intensively, up to 16 hours a day, sometimes sitting up all night with his character sheets. In his confession to the FBI, Darren included his alias, Demon Sammy Sager, his D&D fighter-assassin name. Darren told police they were fooling around drinking at Mary's house while her parents were away, getting ready for a Friday 13th party, and tied her up to mess with her mind, then put a knotted elastic bandage around her throat and went upstairs to have a couple of beers. When they checked again, Mary was dead, the blood to her brain cut off by the bandage. Darren and Ron then stole valuables from the house, dumped Mary's body in this woods, and fled in her car. When they were caught, they were each wearing one of her earrings. The point is Darren Molitor a cold-blooded killer, or did Demon Sammy Sager take over or change him? Darren's trial was first. The defense lawyer maintains that the game was a major factor in determining Darren's behavior, and he is asking for the lesser charge of manslaughter. The prosecution holds that the game has nothing to do with Darren's actions and is asking for the death penalty. Pat Pulling was here to testify. She and a defense psychiatrist say there are elements here that echo D&D patterns. First, the idea itself that tying someone up is a game. The Friday 13th motif, part of the superstitious magic of D&D. The messing with her mind, the robbery like plunder, the running for survival, the earrings like treasure. But no testimony about the game, including Pat Pulling's, was allowed by the judge. And Darren's lawyer, Lee Patton, was angry at that, saying the court preferred an open and shut case.
In the absence of Dungeons and Dragons, in the absence of the desensitization to violence,
I think he probably would have called the police or taken some other action rather than robbing and running.
Darren told Lee Patton Demon has never died, and Patton is not sure just what that means. Darren's parents don't know much about it, but they feel the game is partly to blame, and they say Darren was worried that being Demon might have affected him.
And he'd sign everything, his papers, while he was going to school, as Demon, Molitor.
The prosecution is denying the testimony on the game.
I heard.
Do you think that's important that it be admitted?
Yes. Yes, I do. I feel it'll turn the whole thing around. On Darren's behalf.
The victim's parents feel differently.
Our own thoughts have always been that Dungeons and Dragons was totally irrelevant to the entire case, that this was a case strictly of robbery and homicide and nothing else. These were two people who wanted money in a car and were willing to do just about anything to get it, and did.
These police and FBI agents were struck by how coldly Darren talks about the killing and tend to believe he is just plain guilty. The judge agreed and ruled that Dungeons and Dragons had nothing to do with the death of Mary Towie. The jury found Darren Molitor, alias Demon Sammy Sager, guilty of first-degree murder, a life sentence, but no death penalty.
As you near the castle, two of the stone gargoyles come from above and swoop down trying to attack you.
The crucial point is, can a game create psychosis, or is someone like Darren Molitor an accident waiting to happen, with or without the game? Supporters of D&D suggest it might even keep psychosis under control, providing an outlet.
Can I give him a proper burial?
But the killings and suicides are extreme cases of the issue. Matthew here cried for days when his character died, and Bill's mother says at one point he got too involved.
I became concerned, and I spoke to the dungeon master about his behavior in the club. And he did admit that my son seemed to be becoming the character, taking on characteristics of his character. And I felt the same way. And I asked that he not go to the game for a while, and he agreed.
Here in Orangeville, another case raised the same questions. A 14-year-old boy, who cannot be named because he is a juvenile, strangled two young friends in this schoolyard. It was brought out in this Orangeville courtroom that the young defendant was deeply involved in playing Dungeons and Dragons and was in fact a dungeon master. But his preoccupation with the game was not considered a determining factor in forming his behavior, only typical of it. He was judged to have an obsessive-compulsive mental disorder and was acquitted by reason of legal insanity. The boy will be under care in a psychiatric institution for as long as necessary. Meanwhile, the game goes on. D&D has been banned in some Canadian schools, but is used by others like this one in programs for gifted children. Some teachers feel this role-playing is valuable social interaction and say it even improves reading and mathematics skills and knowledge of mythology and history. Much depends on the dungeon master, the group leader who controls the scenario, putting in as much or as little blood and gore as he likes. Here, Denny is the dungeon master.
Well, it gives you a great sense of control and power over other people, because, you can determine what happens to the characters. And it's really kind of neat, the feeling of power you get from it.
Does the game encourage or even create Denny's love of power, or is it a healthy outlet for it?
In the manual itself, you warn the kids not to get their characters mixed up with themselves.
It's not a warning. All it is saying is that you understand this is a game, and you're playing a character, and that's it.
Pat Pulling is suing TSR and the teachers who conducted the game in her son's school for $10 million. She wants research into the D&D phenomenon.
We would like to see these violent games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, taken out of toy stores and not pushed in school systems and remain for the adult population.
Well, I think the parents should get into the game to see how it is, and then they can start judging if they should let their child play or not. I only play here, and when I leave the store, I leave the game in the store. I go out into life.
You guys bury the body properly,
Perhaps this is the crux of the matter, how we deal with the undeniable love of violence in our species. D&D has taken it a step beyond even TV and movies and books, into the inner mind. Millions enjoy that voyage, but we don't really know how many others find unsuspected dragons in their psychic dungeons. How, then, do we deal with our demons?
As you're walking over the drawbridge, the old rotten wood gives way beneath your feet and you fall 1,500 meters down. So you have died. I'm sorry, but that's life.
For the Journal, this is Carol Jerome in Toronto.
Children anywhere from grammar school on up. Not so with a lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders. The idea of the game, which is played by highly imaginative and intelligent kids, is to assume the role of one of the characters. One game can go on for weeks or even months. The problem seems to be that some kids take it more seriously than others, take it a step further, playing a character who brings them the power in a game they couldn't possibly get in real life.
About 2 months ago, a green eyeball was seen up in the sky. 2 months ago, a green eyeball was seen up in the sky. This eyeball was so big it blotted out the sun, okay?
These young people are playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's an enormously complicated game in which each player chooses an imaginary character he'll assume. There are dwarfs, knights and thieves, gods and devils, magic and spells. It's a journey into a land of fantasy through complicated mazes where you use your wits to kill your enemies before they kill you, all in a quest for wealth and power. The Dungeon Master orchestrates and referees the game, creating scenarios both complicated and terrifying. There is no board, only the dice.
I've never seen dice like these. All different sides.
Six-sided.
What's the point in that?
They're for different things. The four-sided is used mainly for damage from a dagger and dart, and magic users hit points. Hit points is the damage that you can take before you die.
There are those who are fearful that the game in the hands of vulnerable kids could do harm, and there is evidence that seems to support that view. Timothy Grice, 21, a shotgun suicide. The detective report noted D&D became a reality. Irving Bink Pulling, 16, an avid D&D player, a suicide. Daniel and Stephen Irwin, 16 and 12, a murder and a suicide. The police said they were obsessed with the game. James Allen Kirby, 14 years old, charged with killing his junior high school principal and wounding 3 other people. Police are blaming D&D. Jeffrey Jaklovich, 14. Stephen Loyacano, 16. Michael Dempsey, 17. And the list goes on. The company that makes the Dungeons and Dragons material is TSR Incorporated of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. They estimate there are 3 to 4 million kids who play the game. Last year, they grossed nearly $30 million, with Dungeons and Dragons books and paraphernalia accounting for most of those sales. Gary Gygax owns the company and invented the game. Dieter Sturm is the head of public relations.
There are a number of cases that have been documented where there is some connection between D&D. I'm not saying that D&D is the cause of the death, but paraphernalia from the game has been found at the scene of the death. Notes, suicide notes referring to the game have been found, and all of these people, in a dozen or so cases, have been documented as avid D&D players. And you see no connection whatsoever?
We see no connection for the fact that right now there's some 3 to 4 million players of the game actively throughout the United States. Right at this particular time, 1985, teenage suicide is epidemic across the country, with some 5,000 kids a year now taking their lives. I think that to say that because that child played Dungeons & Dragons, who's to say that that child does not watch television, does not participate in high school sports, or what per se?
I have yet to see one bit of valid clinical evidence to show that this has been anything more than coincidental with a disturbed child. If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? And that's all people would do.
I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
But the families who have suffered the loss of a loved one would disagree. Pat and Lee Pulling and their 12-year-old daughter, Melissa. The Pullings came home one night 3 years ago and found Bink, their son, dead on the front lawn of their home in Montpelier, Virginia. He had shot himself through the heart with his father's handgun. Until that night, they had never heard of the game Dungeons and Dragons. Then they began looking through his things.
We went into the kitchen, and there on the table were what we thought were just regular composition books with schoolwork in it, and much of the Dungeons and Dragons material, along with this curse he had received in the game that day that he died.
The curse that was placed on Bink's D&D character began, "Your soul is mine. I choose the time." In a letter that he left, Bink said he had been summoned to kill himself because he was evil.
It was obvious through his writings that he felt he had assumed this character. But what I couldn't get into my mind was, is it possible? How could anybody do that? How could a 16-year-old that is smart, intelligent, why would they believe that they were something in a game, and why would they kill themselves because somebody else said to do it?
Your son was well-adjusted?
Always. He had never had psychological problems. He was healthy, even physically healthy.
Well, we found that there's been numerous parents who say that the child's had no problems and such. Very conclusively, we go back to details of reports of classmates, of teachers, of friends and such, who very much kind of show that the youngster didn't fit in to school. He had outside problems and generally problems with his family.
We know that in the case of Dungeons and Dragons, upwards of 3 million kids play the game with no apparent serious consequence. That for them it exercises the imagination and is just good fun. But there are those who are afraid that impressionable, vulnerable kids could be harmed by it. Dr. Thomas Radecki is a psychiatrist who teaches at the University of Illinois Medical School and who is chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence. He has been studying the game for several years and says there are 28 deaths related to Dungeons and Dragons in the last 5 years.
In some of those, it was clearly the decisive element. In other ones, it was just a major element in the thinking of the people at the time they committed suicide or murder. Is not coincidence, not when you have careful documentation, you have careful notes, you have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel, coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
This is make-believe, and nobody's murdered, and there's no violence there. I mean, to use an analogy with another game, who is bankrupted by losing a game of Monopoly? Nobody is, because the money is make-believe, the property is make-believe, and the bankruptcy is make-believe.
It is not like Monopoly. There is no board. It is role-playing, which is typically used for behavior modification. If you're using behavior modification and you are doing violent roles and you're doing negative roles continuously, these children not only begin to have violent dreams or violent thoughts or negative, depressing type things, they become very much a part of this character.
You're role-playing, you're rehearsing, you're developing the character hour after hour, day after day. We're really talking about intense involvement in a very serious form of violence.
The important thing to remember is, if you're playing a character, let's say, for instance, you have an evil character. The rules tell you your evil character is allowed in the scope of the rules to murder people and to rape and plunder. If you're playing a good character, you're the defender of the people. You try to stop the people from raping and plundering. Yeah. But it's just your character that does it on the sheet of paper. When the game is over, the game does not tell you to go out and rape and plunder. Yeah.
But for some kids, it's not as simple as that. Melissa claimed that D&D had become more than just a game for her brother Bink.
Someone threatened you?
Yes.
My brother threatened to kill me one time.
And we found out later that he had threatened to kill her if she told us that he was playing the game. She knew it, and she was actually scared for her life.
After her son's death, Pat Pulling thoroughly investigated the game. She felt so strongly that it was responsible for her son's death that she formed a network of concerned people to warn others about the dangerous aspects of the game. Because of her involvement with D&D, Mrs. Pulling is often consulted by police departments around the country. Last November, in this deserted area outside the small town of Lafayette, Colorado, two brothers, Daniel and Stephen Irwin, 16 and 12 years old, were found dead. It was a murder-suicide. The story was widely covered by newspapers and television, as was the fact that the police said the deaths were caused by the boys' obsession with the game Dungeons and Dragons. Officer Greg Corey was assigned to the case when the boys were first reported missing. He learned that they used to come to this railroad trestle to play the game.
Both boys were here when you came?
Yes, both boys were intertwined, their legs intertwined down in this area. The older boy in this area here, the younger boy laying here with the .22 caliber gun next to his head. Where the gun was found was just to the right of his head area.
As a police officer, as an investigator, did you see a connection between what happened here and the game Dungeons and Dragons?
And the investigation showed that it was a focal point of the boys' lives. They were just enthralled in the game. And this comes from witnesses and the family and the brother, that they were totally obsessed with the game. In fact, would play it for 48 hours straight, sort of a marathon playing.
2 weeks after the police chief announced that Dungeons and Dragons had been the cause of the boys' deaths, he issued a final press release with a different version of his earlier statements. TSR claimed they were vindicated. But Pat Pulling couldn't believe that the police changed their story.
And I said, well, you can't change it. If it's the truth, you can't change it. I mean, children are dying, Ed. Children are dying out there, and people are not telling.
Mrs. Pulling was convinced that it was the threat of a lawsuit by TSR rather than the evidence that made the police chief change his story.
Did you threaten to sue the city?
No, we did not threaten to sue. We did send them a letter, which we asked them in a very kind way that they please further investigation and take a look at exactly what all the evidence is and what the details are specifically before they start calling the name of our product into it as being a blame or cause.
But Mrs. Pulling had received a letter from the police chief in Lafayette in which he said that it was his fear of a lawsuit that made him back off.
Yes, he sent me a letter.
The letter to Mrs. Pulling from the chief of police said in part, "I sincerely hope you will understand what has happened and will forgive me. I do not feel very good about myself, and I feel that I have lost a part of my integrity. May I say that the city administrator and city attorney were very supportive of me, but cautious. My obligation to the city as a whole to protect them from serious financial litigation was predominant."
I wept. I mean, I said, boy, you know, maybe somebody was going to really take and pay attention to this now and start doing some serious research and start stopping children from dying over something that they didn't have to die.
I don't think anyone is suggesting that your intentions originally with this game were anything but good. It was a game to have some fun. But in the light of what some people would consider to be strong evidence, don't you really think that you have to rethink your position about the game and at least make known the potential for abuse of the game?
Well, I again have to go back and say there's no link that this is, except perhaps in the minds of those people who are looking desperately for any other cause than perhaps their own failure as a parent for their child's death. And further, anything can be abused. Are we going to try to go around and say, this chair could be used by a violent person to strike another person, therefore it should have a warning label on it saying, caution, this can be used to assault you with?
We would like an impartial inquiry by the Consumer Product Safety Commission to actually look into these deaths, to call the police, call the detectives forward, bring forth the evidence, bring the parents in, look at this. Let's have an inquiry, an open public inquiry, and let's find out the truth.
This Friday, the town of Putnam, Connecticut will hold a town meeting to discuss whether Dungeons and Dragons should continue to be played in their schools. The suicide of a 13-year-old Putnam boy has once again fanned the controversy.
It began as a cult phenomenon, then it caught on. Now a new game is sweeping the country.
You will burn forever and ever in eternal torment. You are no more.
The role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons debuted in 1974. It became a hit with many adolescents, but critics claimed it was an invitation to devil worship.
The witchcraft, the demonism, the spells.
And worse.
It is not fun and games.
The media set off a satanic panic.
A lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
That connection has been largely debunked.
It's nothing but a witch hunt.
And the game has generated an unexpected legacy.
This was a revolution.
On a summer day in August 1979, the family of a missing teenager called a Texas investigator named William Deere with some startling information.
Dallas Egbert had disappeared from Michigan State University during the summer session.
James Dallas Egbert III was a 16-year-old sophomore, and his family hired Deere to help find him.
He was a computer nerd, and he had a large amount of hair and carried his little briefcase. I wasn't sure that I was being told exactly what precipitated his disappearance, so I said, well, I guess the best thing we can do is I'll go to Michigan State University and I'll find out for myself exactly what was going on.
What he found when he went to Egbert's dorm room was a shelf of neatly stacked books and something else.
There was a cork board with a series of tacks.
In what might look like a random pattern of thumbtacks, the investigator saw what he thought could be a clue. The shape resembled a building that was part of a network of underground campus steam tunnels, which students told him they sometimes explored.
We set out with maps, and we started going into the tunnels one morning with press everywhere. I entered with the idea that I did not know what I was getting into.
But he had a hunch that it had something to do with a game that was growing in popularity.
This is a quest in a fantasy world of castles and dungeons, monsters and dragons. This world has become real to these people. It's all part of a game called Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D, was created by the late Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in the early 1970s. It was born out of their love for military war games, and they devised scenarios with made-up characters that incorporated their interest in history and fantasy fiction. Gygax said it provided an escape.
All of us at times feel a little inadequate in dealing with the modern world. It would feel much better if we knew that we were a superhero or a mighty wizard.
The game is played in a group, and the guide, or dungeon master,
You enter a very small room.
talks the players through the fictional, sometimes violent adventures they will go on.
And each has an elaborate scoring sheet for his character, with points for wisdom and strength and the like. A throw of these special dice decide the outcome of battles in an intricate scoring system. Nothing is acted out. The real action is in the mind.
Now you guys are entering the castle.
But some, including Deere, worried that while the action was imaginary, some kids might take it too far.
You're leaving the world of reality into the world of fantasy. It advocated murder, decapitation. And I'm going, this isn't a healthy game. How can it be a healthy game?
That game, and Deere's hunch that Egbert was playing it in the tunnels, made great fodder for headlines, but it was a dead end, and Deere went back to Texas empty-handed.
It wasn't within a day or two that the phone call came in. And I was told where I could find him, that he was still alive. So we flew out, and I'm trying to remember his exact words, but he couldn't really say a lot. And I left it like that.
Egbert was a complicated teenager whose disappearance was never fully explained and who later committed suicide.
There was speculation he was the victim of a campus game called Dungeons and Dragons, but after a month-long nationwide search, he was found unharmed.
Deere fed into the growing suspicions about D&D in a book that pointed to the game as a culprit in Egbert's disappearance. But Tim Kask, who helped develop D&D with Gary Gygax, says Deere was just hyping the story for personal gain.
He was a publicity hound, and he knew that he could hang it on D&D and gather a lot of media frenzy, and he did. Dallas Egbert is a tragic story. Brilliant young man, sent off to university at 15. It had nothing to do with D&D in the steam tunnels.
Still, that attention set off an unexpected chain of events.
Our stock took off, literally. We sold thousands of more copies within 90 days of all that stuff happening, and we were up in print runs. That's when we took off.
Sales nearly quadrupled the year after Egbert disappeared. As the cult game was going mainstream, Dungeons and Dragons generated interest in two conflicting groups, people who wanted to buy it and those who wanted to ban it. And televangelists took on a new crusade.
They are kids like yours, like the ones in your neighborhood. Kids who are turning to darkness because society has shut God out.
Conservative fundamentalist Christian group would see a game that involved satanic figures, evil figures. That would be a source of concern.
Dungeons and Dragons has been called the most effective introduction to the occult in the history of man. It is a fantasy role-playing game that teaches demonology, witchcraft.
Gygax, a religious man himself, was put on the defensive. The company hired psychologist Dr. Joyce Brothers to fend off criticism.
There is good and evil in life, and the way Dungeons and Dragons is set up is that good triumphs over evil.
Tim Kask says that in private, he and Gygax couldn't believe the game was being linked to devil worship.
Without sounding disrespectful at all, we laughed our butts off most of the time. Because it's like, are you kidding me? You really think we're teaching your children demonology?
But the controversy grew after the news media reported that a string of teen murders and suicides had one thing in common. The killers or victims were D&D players.
Mary Towie was killed by two friends, Ron Adcox and Darren Molitor. The crucial point is, can a game create psychosis, or is someone like Darren Molitor an accident waiting to happen, with or without the game?
If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? And that's all people would do.
I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
But many grieving parents believed there was a connection. Pat Pulling's teenage son committed suicide, and she spoke publicly, claiming that his game playing contributed to his death.
These children not only begin to have violent dreams or violent thoughts or negative, depressing type things, they become very much a part of this character.
Young people commit suicide for a whole variety of reasons. In my research, I saw nothing that led anyone towards depression or suicide.
Northwestern University professor of sociology, Gary Allen Fine, wrote a book called Shared Fantasy and studied the D&D subculture.
They were the kind of kids and young people who didn't go to dances or date on the weekends. It was part of a nerd culture, I guess you would say.
I can still throw death spells, huh, Steve?
The D&D culture intrigued filmmakers and fiction writers. Rona Jaffe's book, Mazes and Monsters, was loosely based on what people thought had happened to Dallas Egbert. It was made into a movie starring a young Tom Hanks.
Let the journey begin. Well, which way do we go?
They went down the storm tunnels and got to play D&D in the tunnels. We had to sit around a table. Like how awesome would it have been if it turned out that D&D was like what they did?
Cory Doctorow is a writer and activist who early on was profiled as an avid D&D player in this story from 1985.
The moral panic was mostly laughable. The idea that there were people who were fundamentalist Christians for whom Dungeons and Dragons represented some kind of existential threat to my soul was silly. You could go around and have really satisfying arguments with like profoundly ignorant grown-ups.
Over time, the Dungeons and Dragons controversy lost steam. And today, the common thread between D&D players is less likely to include any reported links to violence, and more likely to involve Emmy Awards and literary prizes. Stephen Colbert and writers Ta-Nehisi Coates and Juno Diaz are among the millions of smart, bookish kids who played D&D and shrugged off any sense of panic.
People were bananas. My mom moral panicked. She was way more worried about us getting shanked, or getting caught up in some nonsense.
It was a lot of fun. It also provided them a variety of other skills, leadership skills, negotiation skills.
We helped each other without even knowing it, man. I learned an enormous amount about what it meant to be courageous and what it meant to be passionate and the kind of hard moral choices that one needs to make in real life in this kind of fake, sort of imagined plane of action.
And for Diaz, as a young immigrant from the Dominican Republic, the game had special meaning.
This was a revolution. Being a bunch of kids of color in a society that tells us that we're nothing, being permitted and are under our own power to be heroic, to have agency, to do the hero stuff, to take and be on adventures. There was nothing like it for us. It was very, 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 very impactful.
While some parents used to worry about what kids were playing, now they're more likely to be worried about how they're playing.
Cell phones and social media have revolutionized the way we live, but how has plugging in changed the way your kids are growing up?
Through the 20th century, you have this tension between free play and controlled media. I mean, we were concerned about what sitting in darkened movie theaters would do to our children. Just wait 30 years and they will be worried about what their children are doing. And it will no doubt be something different than sexting and bullying as we know it today. This is not a new phenomenon. It just changes with each new technology.
The American Academy of Pediatrics says that in this media-saturated age, it's important for kids to use their imaginations in free play. And in a twist, the role-playing games that set off a moral panic in the past may look more like a solution than a problem to today's parents.
It's a great thing to dream yourself in other places, and it helps understand who you are. It's just nice to spend a lot of time thinking, imagining, in a group, collaborating.
Mommy is awesome.
Imagination is a good thing, man. Very powerful.